the soft melody of a string quartet drifted through the luxurious glasswood estate as hundreds of guests admired the elegant decorations, sparkling candles, and breathtaking floral arrangements that surrounded the grand wedding celebration of Adrian Foster and Claire Whitmore. Among the smiling faces stood Adrian's widowed mother, Eleanor Foster, dressed in a graceful pale blue gown that she had carefully saved for months to purchase, quietly hoping that seeing her son begin a new chapter would erase the loneliness she had carried since losing her husband many years earlier. Eleanor noticed that Adrian barely looked at her throughout the evening, and every time she tried to congratulate him or share a small smile, he quickly turned toward another guest as though pretending she wasn't there. She convinced herself he was simply overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the day, refusing to believe the uneasy feeling in her heart that something far more painful was about to happen. As the photographer gathered immediate family members for the official portraits, Eleanor slowly walked toward the stage with a warm smile, believing she had finally been invited to stand beside her only child on the happiest day of his life. Before she could reach him, Adrian's voice echoed across the ballroom as he angrily ordered her to leave, accusing her of always finding ways to embarrass him and insisting that she had no place in the celebration anymore. The cheerful conversations disappeared instantly, replaced by stunned silence as guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while Claire lowered her eyes without saying a single word. Eleanor felt every stare pierce her heart, yet she refused to defend herself because she knew that arguing would only create another painful memory everyone present would remember forever. Without raising her voice, she gently placed the small wedding gift she had carried so carefully onto a nearby table and thanked one elderly guest who quietly whispered that she deserved better than this. She walked through the enormous entrance doors with slow, steady steps, determined that her son would never remember seeing his mother beg for kindness in front of strangers. The drive home felt longer than ever before as rain began falling against Eleanor's windshield, blurring the city lights until they looked like fading memories instead of familiar streets. Every mile reminded her of a different chapter of Adrian's childhood. From the first bicycle she bought after working extra night shifts to the countless evenings she stayed awake helping him prepare for school exams while hiding her own exhaustion behind gentle smiles. When she finally unlocked the front door of her quiet cottage, the silence inside seemed almost comforting compared to the humiliation she had just endured. She placed the unopened gift receipt from the wedding on the kitchen counter, made herself a cup of warm tea, and sat by the fireplace, wondering how the little boy who once promised to protect her forever had become a man who couldn't even offer her basic respect. Sleep never came that night because every corner of the house carried memories of sacrifices no one else had witnessed, including unpaid bills she quietly managed, dreams she postponed, and opportunities she willingly gave up so Adrian could attend the best schools she could possibly afford. As the first rays of morning's sunlight slipped through the curtains, she accepted a truth she had spent years avoiding, realizing that endless giving without boundaries had slowly taught her son to mistake love for obligation. Late the following afternoon, Adrian unexpectedly arrived at her home, wearing an expensive suit and carrying the same impatient attitude he had displayed at the wedding reception. Instead of apologizing, he immediately asked for access to the legal documents connected to the family orchard, explaining that a business investor wanted proof he would eventually control the property and insisting there was no time for emotional conversations. Eleanor quietly invited him to sit down before placing a small wooden box containing decades of family records on the dining table, but she kept the ownership papers locked safely inside the cabinet behind her. Looking directly into his eyes with calm confidence, she gently explained that land could never be trusted to someone who valued wealth more than the people whose sacrifices had made that wealth possible, leaving Adrian speechless for a brief moment before frustration pushed him out the front door once again. Days slowly turned into weeks, and for the first time in decades Eleanor stopped arranging her entire life around the possibility that Adrian might suddenly call or visit without notice. She joined a neighborhood gardening club, reconnected with old friends she had neglected for years, and discovered that peace often arrives quietly when a person finally chooses to stop chasing someone else's approval. Meanwhile, Adrian's new marriage began losing the shine that had impressed everyone at the wedding, as constant disagreements over money, social status, and business decisions filled the beautiful house he had once proudly shown to everyone. Claire expected a life of endless luxury and influence, while Adrian became increasingly frustrated trying to satisfy expectations that seemed to grow larger with every passing week. Family members occasionally carried bits of news to Eleanor, but she never asked questions or offered opinions because she believed some lessons could only be understood through personal experience. Instead, she focused on rebuilding herself, filling the empty rooms of her cottage with fresh flowers, cheerful music, and hobbies that reminded her she was still capable of creating happiness without depending on anyone else. One quiet evening, a hesitant knock echoed through her front porch, and when Eleanor opened the door she found Adrian standing there with tired eyes, wrinkled clothes, and a face that looked years older than the confident groom who had humiliated her only weeks earlier. He admitted that he hadn't slept peacefully in months because arguments had become a daily part of his marriage, and despite owning expensive things, he felt strangely empty every time he returned home. Eleanor listened without interrupting or criticizing him, offering nothing more than a warm meal and a place to rest for a little while before they spoke about the pain that had been silently growing between them. When Adrian cautiously mentioned the family orchard once again, she calmly replied that respect could never be exchanged for signatures on paper, and although disappointment filled his face, he quietly accepted her answer before leaving with far more questions than he had brought with him. Months passed, and the distance between them was no longer filled with anger but with quiet reflection that neither of them could escape. Adrian often found himself sitting alone after work, replaying the painful scene from his wedding over and over, until the memory became impossible to silence, making him realize that the loudest regret in life is often created by a single careless moment. One crisp autumn afternoon, he returned to Eleanor's cottage carrying nothing except a small basket of fresh bread from the local bakery, a gesture so simple that it surprised even him. Instead of forcing conversation, he helped her gather fallen leaves from the garden, repaired a loose fence near the vegetable patch, and spent the afternoon working beside her without expecting praise or forgiveness. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills, Adrian finally admitted that success had changed him into someone he no longer recognized, someone who measured people by what they could provide instead of who they truly were. Eleanor quietly confessed that she had also made mistakes by protecting him from every disappointment during childhood, unintentionally allowing him to believe that life would always reward him regardless of how he treated others. Their conversations became more frequent after that day, and each visit felt less like an obligation and more like two adults patiently rebuilding trust that had once seemed impossible to recover. Adrian began asking about his father's values, the struggles Eleanor had hidden for years, and the sacrifices she never mentioned because she believed love should be given freely rather than advertised. One evening, while they watched the sunset from the old wooden porch, Adrian carefully brought up the subject of the orchard for the final time, but his voice carried humility instead of entitlement. Eleanor smiled gently before telling him that true inheritance was never measured by acres of land or legal papers, but by the character a person built through honesty, compassion, and responsibility. And for the first time he nodded without arguing because he finally understood the lesson she had been trying to teach all along. Winter arrived quietly, covering the orchard with a blanket of silver frost, and not long afterward Adrian's marriage officially came to an end when months of resentment and constant arguments finally became impossible to repair. Instead of blaming Claire or searching for excuses, he accepted responsibility for the choices that had led him there, understanding that many of the painful consequences he faced had begun long before the wedding day. He visited Eleanor again, not asking for a place to stay or financial help, but simply hoping to spend time with the woman whose love he had once taken for granted. They shared long conversations over homemade dinners, laughed about old childhood memories, and slowly replaced years of silence with honest words that neither of them had been brave enough to speak before. As spring returned, Adrian devoted his weekends to restoring the neglected family orchard, planting new trees, repairing broken fences, and helping elderly neighbors whenever they needed assistance without expecting anything in return. Eleanor watched these quiet acts of kindness from a distance, realizing that genuine change is never announced through grand speeches but revealed through consistent actions repeated day after day. One peaceful afternoon, Eleanor invited Adrian to sit beneath the oldest apple tree on the property and placed a small wooden box on the table between them. Inside were the ownership documents he had once demanded with pride, and she explained that she was entrusting them to him not because he was her son, but because he had finally become a man who understood that protecting people would always matter more than possessing property. Years later, visitors to the orchard often admired the close bond between the gentle owner and his wise mother without ever knowing how much pain, regret, and patience had been required to rebuild that relationship from the ground up. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.